Black mechanic rescues woman and her kids in blizzard. What happened next was unthinkable. The world of politics often feels like a hidden stage where leaders say things behind closed doors that most ordinary people never hear. Yet sometimes, the words spoken by powerful men escape into the open, and they carry the weight of thunder. This was exactly what happened when Mohammed bin Salman, widely known as MBs, gave a stern warning to Ibrahim Traore, the young and determined leader of Burkina Faso. The words, "We'll crush you in any battle," were not said lightly. They were a declaration that carried history, power, and intimidation. For people who had followed global affairs, it was no surprise that MBs spoke with such confidence. He was the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, a country rich in oil, wealth, and influence. He had built an image of being both strong and unyielding, a man whose words could shake global markets. To challenge him seemed like standing in front of a storm. But for those who knew Ibrahim Traore, they understood that this was not a man who feared storms. He was young, fiery, and full of conviction. To him, the voice of MBs was just another voice trying to impose dominance. And in his heart, Traore had already decided that his answer would not be silence. The first time Traore heard about the warning, he was sitting in a modest office surrounded by his closest advisors. The air was thick with heat, and the sound of chatter outside the building made it hard to focus. One of his aides rushed in with a report, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the document on the table. "Excellency," the aide said, "MBs has spoken. He says Saudi Arabia can crush us in any battle." The words felt heavy in the room, as if the walls themselves were listening. For a moment, no one moved. The advisors looked at each other, unsure of what their leader would say. Traore leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as though he was searching for strength in the cracks above. Then he slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His face was calm, almost too calm for the situation. He whispered, "So they believe they can crush us." The aide nodded nervously, waiting for more. But Traore did not speak right away. He took a deep breath, and when he finally raised his eyes, there was fire in them. Outside that small office, life in Burkina Faso went on as usual. Market women bargained over tomatoes, children ran barefoot through dusty streets, and elders sat under trees talking about the heat. But underneath the routine, there was a deep current of struggle. The country had faced years of hardship, instability, and foreign interference. The people were tired of leaders who bowed their heads too easily, tired of being treated as though they had no voice. When Ibrahim Traore rose to power, he carried with him the hopes of the ordinary people who wanted someone to speak with strength. So when he heard the warning from MBs, he didn't just think of himself. He thought of those children in the streets, those women in the markets, and those elders under the trees. "Tell them this," Traore finally said when the warning from MBs reached Ibrahim Traore, and his reply was carried back. "Then step into the fight." The world began to pay attention. Leaders across Africa and beyond raised their eyebrows, wondering how such a young captain-turned-president could dare to respond so boldly to one of the most powerful men in the Middle East. But Traore did not see himself as reckless. He saw himself as a man defending his people's dignity, and that belief gave him strength. The news spread quickly, from the dusty streets of Ouagadougou to the glossy offices of foreign capitals. In tea shops and marketplaces, people repeated his words with admiration. A woman selling fruit told her neighbor, "Did you hear what our leader said? He told them to step into the fight. No one has spoken like this in years." A group of young men sitting under a tree nodded with pride. To them, Traore's courage meant that their country was no longer a shadow in the background of global politics. For once, Burkina Faso was standing tall. But admiration alone could not calm the storm that was building. In diplomatic circles, some voices whispered that Traore had gone too far. They warned that challenging a figure like MBs could invite consequences that Burkina Faso was not prepared to handle. Saudi Arabia's wealth and influence were vast, stretching across international banks, energy markets, and global organizations. Traore's advisors worried quietly, asking themselves if his boldness would lead the nation into deeper struggles. Yet when they looked at him, they saw no hesitation. Traore's response had not been made in anger. It was deliberate, a choice he felt he had to make. He knew that silence would have sent the wrong message, that his nation could be threatened without resistance. In his mind, replying with strength was the only path forward. It was not about seeking war or provoking conflict, it was about showing the world that Burkina Faso's voice mattered. Even a small country, he believed, could carry itself with honor if it refused to be intimidated. One evening, as the warm wind swept across the capital, Traore gathered with a group of elders. These were respected men and women who had seen the country through decades of change, through both peace and hardship. He wanted to hear their wisdom. The gathering took place in a simple courtyard, with wooden chairs arranged in a circle and lanterns casting a soft glow. An elder spoke first, his voice deep with age. "My son," he said, "you have spoken boldly, and the people are proud. But bold words bring bold challenges. Are you ready to carry the weight of what may come?" Traore looked at the old man and replied with quiet confidence. "If I do not carry it, then who will? If we remain silent when threatened, our children will learn to live in silence too. I will not let that be our legacy." His words touched the hearts of those present. Though the elders feared for the future, they also felt a sense of reassurance. This was not a leader who would bow down. This was a leader willing to bear the burden for the sake of his people. Meanwhile, in foreign capitals, analysts studied every word. Some thought Traore was foolish, others believed he was a rising voice who could inspire movements across Africa. International newspapers published headlines about the exchange, and debates filled television screens. Was this the spark of a new kind of African leadership, or was it a step too close to danger? The world could not agree, but it could not ignore him either. Back home, Traore's words were beginning to shape something more powerful than politics: unity. In villages far from the capital, people began to speak about their nation with pride. Teachers told their students, "Do you see? Our leader is not afraid. You too must believe in yourselves." Farmers in the fields said to one another, "If he can stand up to the powerful, then surely we can endure our struggles." Even those who once doubted him started to admire his courage. His words had ignited a spirit that had long been missing, the belief that their voices mattered. But Traore himself was not carried away by the praise. In the quiet of night, he sat with his closest confidants and admitted the truth. "This is not a game," he said softly. "They will test us. They will try to pressure us in ways we cannot yet imagine. We must be ready." His tone was serious, but his eyes still carried determination. To him, the warning from MBs was not an end, it was only the beginning of a long path where every step would test his resolve. In the following weeks, the tension grew. Though no direct actions were taken, the air was thick with anticipation. Rumors spread of possible sanctions, of backroom deals being arranged to isolate Burkina Faso. Foreign envoys visited with polite smiles but hidden questions, asking Traore if he truly intended to stand by his words. Each time, he answered calmly, never wavering. "We will not kneel," he said again and again. His consistency became his strength. At the same time, Traore understood that words alone were not enough. He began to focus on strengthening ties with neighboring African countries, believing that unity was the key to survival. "If one tree stands alone, the wind will break it," he told his ministers. "But if the forest stands together, the wind cannot move it." Slowly, conversations began with leaders from Mali, Niger, and others who understood the importance of solidarity. His response to MBs had not only been a defense of Burkina Faso, it was also a call for Africa to rise together. The ordinary people did not always understand the complex strategies, but they understood the feeling of pride. They repeated his words in conversations, wrote them on walls, and shared them in songs and poems. Children in schools whispered them like a chant, then step into the fight. To them, it was not about conflict but about courage, the courage to believe in themselves and their nation. As days turned into weeks, Traore realized that his response had shifted something deep within the people. Where once there had been doubt and hesitation, now there was confidence. Where there had been fear, there was now hope. He knew challenges were still ahead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt his nation standing with him, not behind him. The moment that had begun with a warning had transformed into something larger than anyone had expected. Mbesa's words were meant to intimidate, but instead, they had lit a fire of defiance and unity in a small nation that refused to bend. And as Ibrahim Traore looked out at his people, he realized that his simple but powerful reply had become more than just a statement. It had become a promise that no matter how great the pressure, Burkina Faso would meet it with courage, dignity, and the belief that even the smallest nation could stand tall. The echo of Traore's response continued to travel far beyond Burkina Faso. Then step into the fight was not just a sentence anymore, it had become a symbol, a statement that carried both pride and risk. While the people at home embraced it as a moment of courage, the outside world was now watching closely, wondering if this young leader had gone too far. Diplomats in different regions began to talk in private meetings, asking the same question: what would happen next? The tension between the two leaders was not just about words. It was about the balance of power. On one side stood MBs, backed by vast oil wealth, modern infrastructure, and global influence. On the other stood Traore, representing a small nation that had faced decades of instability but carried a growing sense of resilience. The difference in resources was enormous, yet the difference in determination was not so clear. And that uncertainty is what made the world pay attention. Inside Burkina Faso, the people were both excited and anxious. They admired the bravery of their leader, but they also whispered questions to each other. Would Saudi Arabia respond? Would pressure come in the form of economic strain, political moves, or something even heavier? Mothers in the markets spoke about it while selling their vegetables. Young men debated it in street corners. Elders discussed it during community gatherings. The uncertainty filled the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Meanwhile, Traore carried himself with calm confidence, though inside he understood the seriousness of the situation. He spent long nights in his office, reading reports, listening to advisors, and thinking through every possible scenario. One of his closest aides once found him staring at a map, his fingers tracing the borders of his country slowly. "Do you ever fear what might come?" the aide asked carefully. Traore turned his head with a faint smile. "Fear comes when you think of losing," he said softly. "But I do not see us losing. I see us standing." Not everyone agreed with him, however. Some voices in his government argued that provoking a powerful leader like MB's could create dangers the country was not ready to handle. They urged him to soften his words, to clarify that he did not mean to challenge Saudi Arabia directly. "Excellency," one minister pleaded, "we cannot fight an empire with bare hands." Traore listened quietly, then replied, "We are not fighting with bare hands. We are fighting with our dignity, and that is something no empire can take away." The room fell silent after his words. Even those who doubted him could not deny the strength in his voice. Beyond his country, the international press painted different pictures. Some newspapers described Traore as reckless, a leader playing with fire. Others called him courageous, a voice for Africa's younger generation. Television debates raged, with analysts arguing whether his words would inspire others or bring disaster. The world was divided, but it was united in one fact: Burkina Faso was no longer ignored. The tension did not stay at the level of words alone. Subtle pressures began to show. Certain trade discussions were delayed. Rumors of financial restrictions started to spread. Some international partners became cautious in their dealings with Burkina Faso. These small but noticeable changes reminded Traore that his reply had set things in motion. Yet rather than backing down, he focused even more on strengthening ties within Africa. He believed that unity among neighboring nations could create a shield stronger than any individual country could build. Meetings were held with leaders from Mali and Niger. The conversations were not always easy, but there was a shared understanding. Together, they could face pressures more effectively. Traore spoke passionately during these meetings. "They believe we are small and divided," he said, "but if we stand as one, they will see that Africa is not weak. It is only weak when we allow ourselves to be separated." His words resonated with the leaders, many of whom felt the same pressures from outside powers. Slowly, a sense of solidarity began to form. At home, the people could feel the shift. They saw their leader not only standing firm but also reaching out to others. In the villages, drums were beaten during celebrations, and songs were sung in his honor. Children repeated his famous words, not as a call to violence but as a call to courage. Even those who had little interest in politics began to feel that they were part of something larger than themselves. The pride was visible everywhere, in the smiles of the market women, in the determination of farmers, and in the bright eyes of students sitting in classrooms. But with pride came responsibility, and Traore felt its weight heavily. Each night, as the city around him grew quiet, he thought about the future. He knew that a single wrong step could bring hardship to his people. He thought about the mothers working hard to feed their families, the soldiers protecting the borders with limited supplies, and the children dreaming of better days. To him, this was the true battle. Not one fought with weapons, but one fought with spirit, unity, and the refusal to be silenced. His response to MBs had opened a door. Now he needed to walk through it carefully. He began to encourage his ministers to look inward as well. "Let us not only resist outside pressure," he told them, "but also build within. If our people are strong inside, no one can break us from outside." Plans were drawn up to improve agriculture, education, and community development, even though resources were limited. Each small effort, he believed, would build a stronger foundation. Weeks passed, and though no direct confrontation came from Saudi Arabia, the tension remained in the air. Yet instead of fear, the people of Burkina Faso felt a growing sense of determination. They believed that their leader's courage was their courage. They believed that standing up, even in the face of overwhelming power, was better than bowing down in silence. This belief gave them strength in their daily lives, turning ordinary struggles into acts of resilience. The world's eyes remained fixed on the unfolding story. Would Traore's boldness eventually bring pressure too heavy to bear, or would it open a new path for African nations to demand respect on the world stage? No one could say for sure. But one thing was clear: the confrontation had already changed something fundamental. Burkina Faso, a country often overlooked, had become a symbol of defiance and dignity. For Traore, this was not about winning a battle of threats. It was about teaching his people and perhaps the world that true power is not only in wealth or armies. It is in the spirit of a people who choose not to kneel. And as the days moved forward, he carried this thought like a shield, ready for whatever the next step of the story would bring. The days turned into weeks, and what had started as a sharp exchange of words slowly shifted into something larger and more complicated. It became clear that there would be no direct clash of armies, no sudden explosions of force. Instead, the confrontation took the form of strategies, silent pressures, and a quiet war of influence. The tension was no less real just because it did not involve weapons. For Ibrahim Traore, this new stage of the struggle was in many ways even more challenging. Saudi Arabia's strength was not only in its wealth but also in the reach of its voice across the globe. Newspapers, television channels, and international platforms often carried messages that favored the Saudi view. Subtle stories appeared, questioning whether Burkina Faso could handle its bold leader's decisions. Commentators hinted that Traore's words were reckless, that he was dragging his people into danger. These voices were amplified through global media networks, reaching even those in Burkina Faso who had little access to outside news. It was an attempt to shape the world's view of him and, at the same time, to shake the confidence of his own people. Traoré was aware of this. In his office, he read translations of articles, watched clips of debates, and listened as his advisors summarized foreign reports. He did not respond with anger, but he felt the pressure. He knew that in a world of information, words could cut deeper than swords. And so, he decided to answer not with silence, but with his own message, a message that spoke not of fear, but of unity. He traveled to towns and villages, standing before crowds in dusty squares, speaking directly to the people. His words were simple but strong. "Do not listen to those who call us weak," he told them. "We are not weak when we stand together. We are strong, stronger than any wealth can buy. Our dignity cannot be sold, and our spirit cannot be crushed." Each time he spoke, the crowds cheered, their voices rising in chants that echoed across the fields. His presence among them reminded them that they were not just watching history unfold, they were part of it. At the same time, Traoré worked to build alliances. He knew Burkina Faso could not stand alone forever. Meetings were held in quiet rooms with leaders from other African countries who understood the importance of resisting outside pressure. Mali, Niger, and others listened to his vision. "They want us to fear them separately," he explained, "but if we stand together, no one can dismiss us. A single tree bends in the wind, but a forest stands firm." These words began to plant seeds of solidarity, not only among governments but also among ordinary citizens who longed for a future where their continent was respected and independent. The confrontation also played out in the economic sphere. Burkina Faso felt small ripples as some international partners hesitated to move forward with projects. Loans and agreements that once seemed certain were suddenly delayed. It was not open punishment, but it was pressure nonetheless. Traoré faced difficult choices. Should he bend to ease the strain, or should he continue forward with the harder path of independence? In the quiet of his office, surrounded by maps and reports, he chose the harder path. "We will rely on our own hands first," he told his ministers. "If we can feed ourselves, build for ourselves, and believe in ourselves, then no one can hold us hostage with their wealth." These were brave words, but they also demanded sacrifice. Life in Burkina Faso was already difficult, and the new pressures did not make it easier. Yet, to the surprise of many, the people did not turn against their leader. Instead, they seemed to rally even closer to him. In the markets, women spoke proudly of his defiance. In schools, teachers told children that their leader had shown the world that Burkina Faso had a voice. Soldiers, though poorly equipped compared to great armies, marched with renewed determination, believing that they were defending not only their land but also their nation's honor. Still, the challenge was not only external. Traoré faced the delicate task of keeping his government united. Some officials still worried that he had taken too bold a stance. In private meetings, they urged him to soften his tone, to look for ways to ease the growing tension. He listened respectfully, but he rarely shifted from his position. "If we show weakness now," he reminded them, "then all our words will mean nothing. We must walk the path we have chosen." His firmness, though difficult for some to accept, gave his government a sense of direction. One evening, as the city lights of Ouagadougou flickered under the night sky, Traoré sat quietly on the balcony of his residence. The air was warm, and in the distance he could hear faint sounds of music drifting from the neighborhoods where people gathered after long days of work. He thought about the path his country was on. He knew that the confrontation with MBs had grown into more than a clash between two men. It was now a test of what it meant to lead with dignity in a world shaped by power and wealth. He thought of the young people of his nation, many of whom dreamed of a brighter future. "If my words give them hope," he whispered to himself, "then I cannot regret speaking them." As weeks passed, the world began to realize that neither side would back down. Mbs had not forgotten his warning, but Traore had not softened his reply. Instead of open conflict, the battle continued through strategies, alliances, and the shaping of public opinion. And though Burkina Faso was far smaller than Saudi Arabia, it had something powerful, the sympathy and admiration of many who saw in Traore's defiance a symbol of resistance. Writers, activists, and ordinary people across Africa and beyond spoke of him as an example of courage. The quiet war of influence had turned into a chess game, each move calculated, each word carrying weight. For Mbs, the goal was to maintain dominance and show the world that his warnings were not empty. For Traore, the goal was to prove that dignity and unity could stand against intimidation. Each man watched the other carefully, waiting for the next move. In the heart of Burkina Faso, the people continued to live their daily struggles, farming the land, sending their children to school, building small businesses with limited resources. But now, they did these things with a sense of pride. They knew their leader had stood tall, and they wanted to stand tall too. The phrase "step into the fight" became more than a reply to a warning. It became a motto for a nation determined to shape its own destiny. And as the world watched, one thing became clear: this was no longer simply a story of two leaders exchanging words. It was the unfolding of a larger truth, that even in a world divided by power and wealth, the courage to resist could inspire hope far beyond the borders of a small, landlocked country. The world had waited, watching to see if the bold words exchanged between Mbs and Ibrahim Traore would lead to an open clash. But as the months passed, it became clear that no armies would march, no bombs would fall, and no violent confrontation would erupt. Instead, the story was being written in a quieter but equally powerful way, through dignity, influence, and the shaping of history. For Traore, the absence of direct battle was not a sign of weakness. It was proof that his words had achieved what they were meant to achieve, to show that Burkina Faso could not be silenced or humiliated. People across the country still spoke of the famous reply. In marketplaces, women sold their goods while repeating the words with pride. "Then step into the fight," they said, smiling as though they themselves had spoken them. Children in schools wrote them on notebooks and whispered them like a chant during play. Even elders in villages far from the capital repeated the sentence as if it were a proverb passed down from generations. What had begun as a moment of defiance had grown into something larger, a symbol of national pride, one that reached into every corner of the land. For Traore, this transformation was more important than any show of wealth or power. He saw his people walking taller, speaking with more confidence, and carrying a sense of belonging they had long been denied. In quiet moments, he thought about the deeper meaning of it all. "Perhaps the true victory," he told one of his aides, "is not in defeating a great power but in awakening the strength within our own people." His aide nodded silently, recognizing that his leader was shaping not just politics but also the very spirit of a nation. Beyond Burkina Faso, the story had rippled outward. Other African nations took notice, some quietly admiring the young leader's courage, others openly expressing support. Writers, journalists, and thinkers across the continent began to use his example in speeches and articles. They pointed out that true strength was not measured by weapons or riches alone but also by the courage to speak without fear. Traore's defiance was no longer seen as just his own, it was becoming a part of a wider African conversation about independence, dignity, and unity. Even in foreign capitals, where skepticism once dominated, there was now a measure of respect. Analysts who had first dismissed Traore as reckless began to reconsider. They realized that he had not plunged his country into chaos, nor had he crumbled under pressure. Instead, he had stood his ground calmly, and his nation had rallied around him. Some newspapers even began to write of him as a leader who represented the voice of a younger generation unwilling to accept old patterns of submission. In the quiet of his office, Traore reflected on what had happened. He knew the story was not just about him and Mbs. It was about something much greater, the test of whether small nations could stand with dignity in a world dominated by the wealthy and powerful. He also understood that the confrontation was far from over. There would still be pressures, still be subtle challenges, still be those who doubted him. But he felt certain that the seed of confidence had been planted deeply, and it would continue to grow. The people of Burkina Faso carried on with their daily lives, but they carried themselves differently now. Farmers rose before dawn to work their fields, yet they did so with the belief that they were contributing to something greater. Teachers taught children with an extra measure of hope, telling them that their voices mattered. Soldiers guarded their posts with quiet determination, feeling that they were protecting not only borders but also the pride of their nation. Each act, however small, felt like part of a larger story of resilience. Traoré did not claim to have all the answers. He knew that his country still faced poverty, instability, and many struggles. But he believed that dignity was the first step toward change. If our people believe they are strong, he often said, then they will find the strength to build. If they believe their voices matter, then they will learn to speak with confidence. And if they learn to stand together, then no pressure from outside can ever break them. The confrontation with MBs became a story retold again and again, not as a tale of threat and fear but as a lesson in courage. It was remembered that MBs had spoken with the confidence of wealth and power, but Traoré had answered with the confidence of spirit. No battlefields had been drawn, but the exchange itself had become a turning point in how people saw themselves. It reminded them that even in a world of giants, the smallest voice could still command attention if it refused to tremble. Over time, the story entered into songs, poems, and even everyday conversations. Musicians sang of the day their leader spoke for them, while poets described him as a flame that refused to be put out by the winds of power. In small gatherings, people shared the story with pride, as though it were not only the leader's response but their own. It became a collective memory, one that belonged to the nation. And so, while the world had expected perhaps a clash of weapons or a collapse of leadership, what it saw instead was a quiet transformation. Burkina Faso had gained something no one could take away, a sense of pride rooted in dignity. Mbiza's warning remained in history, but it was Traoré's answer that people remembered most. In the years that followed, the lesson remained clear. Strength does not always mean having the largest army or the greatest wealth. Sometimes strength is simply the courage to say no, to speak with honesty, and to refuse to be silenced. Ibrahim Traoré had shown that courage, and his people had embraced it. The story of his reply became a legacy, one that lived not only in the hearts of Burkinabe people but also in the wider story of Africa's journey toward respect and self-belief. As he stood one evening watching the sun set over the city, the sky painted in gold and crimson, Traoré felt a quiet peace. The battle had not been fought with weapons, yet it had been fought in every heart and every voice. And in that battle, his people had not been crushed. They had risen. Id to his aid. If they believe they can crush us, then let them step into the fight. His voice was firm, and his words carried no fear. The aide froze for a moment, unsure if he had heard correctly. But Traoré repeated himself, louder this time, his hand slamming gently against the wooden desk. Let them step into the fight. The room fell silent. For the first time since the warning had been delivered, the advisors felt a spark of courage rise within them. What Traoré understood and what many of his critics did not was that battles are not always fought with guns or soldiers. Sometimes they are fought with words, with dignity, with the refusal to bend. MBs had power, yes, but Traoré had something equally important, the spirit of resistance. He knew his country could not match Saudi Arabia's wealth, but he also knew that the strength of a nation lies not just in its resources but in the hearts of its people. And the hearts of his people were strong. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and red, Traoré stepped outside to address a small crowd that had gathered. Word of the warning had already begun to spread, and people wanted to know how their leader would respond. He stood tall, his uniform slightly wrinkled, his boots coated in dust. The crowd quieted as he raised his hand. They say they can crush us, he began, his voice echoing in the still air. They believe their power is greater than ours. But I tell you this: no one can crush the will of a people who refuse to kneel. The crowd erupted in cheers. His words carried hope, and in that moment, the people felt united. They did not see themselves as weak. They saw themselves as a nation that would not back down. That night, Traore could not sleep easily. He sat by his desk, writing notes, thinking through strategies, and reflecting on the path ahead. He knew that standing up to someone like Mbs was not without risk. The Crown Prince had influence not just in the Middle East but across the world. He had allies, money, and weapons. But Traore reminded himself that courage often means facing giants with nothing but a stone in your hand, like David facing Goliath. And history has shown that even giants can fall when confronted with determination. In the days that followed, advisors debated endlessly. Some argued that the leader should tread carefully, that provoking a man as powerful as Mbs could lead to isolation. Others encouraged boldness, saying that Traore's refusal to bow would inspire not just his people but also others across Africa who longed for leaders unafraid of global powers. Traore listened to all of them, weighing their words carefully, but in his heart, his decision was already made. He had spoken, and he would stand by it. When he looked out across his country, he did not see weakness. He saw farmers waking before dawn to tend to their fields. He saw teachers struggling to educate children with limited resources but endless patience. He saw mothers who sacrificed their comfort for the future of their families. To him, these were not signs of a nation ready to be crushed. These were signs of resilience, of strength hidden in the ordinary lives of people who refused to give up. And so, the warning from Mbs became more than just a political statement. It became a test of character. For Mbs, it was a chance to show the world that his influence was unmatched. For Traore, it was an opportunity to show that his people would never be intimidated, no matter how powerful the opponent. The stage was set, and the story of defiance had just begun.